I know what you're thinking. Reaper is doing a Wii game? What? Well done, you're able to read the title of the video. So why am I doing a Wii review? Why not? The Wii is a console that is typically thought of as the kids' console. The adults get their Xboxes and their PlayStations, and kids get stuck with the Wii. Granted, there's some fairly mature games like Mad World, but for the most part, Nintendo stuck with the younger crowd. But the game I'm reviewing this week, Trauma Center Second Opinion, is another one of those rare games that have a bit more of a mature subject matter to them. In Trauma Center Second Opinion, you play as a surgeon named Derek Stiles, who just graduated past being an intern and is now a fully licensed doctor. You control him through his early selfish stages, and then further on as he matures as a person. It's one of the things that makes the storyline interesting, as you'll think that he's a know-it-all at first, but then you can't help but side with him once shit starts hitting the fan and he gets dragged into a huge epidemic. In case you didn't know, Trauma Center was originally on the DS, and had the subtitle of Under the Knife. It was a game that was essentially ported to the Wii, but it was also expanded upon and given new missions. You also get access to another surgeon from Japan named Naomi, who happens to have a dark past that is intertwined with Derek's storyline. Being that the game has a lot of dialogue and is heavy on the story, there's one other character I want to talk about. Her name is Angie, and she is the main nurse that accompanies you throughout the game. She's not a big fan of Derek's personality at the beginning of the game, but later on you start noticing that there might be something between the two. She's just as integral to the plot as Derek, so you'll be spending a lot of time with her. So the story. Where to start? There's a lot that I could potentially discuss, but I don't want to ruin anything that could be considered a major spoiler. Minor plot reveals I'm fine with, although I'm sure somebody watching this video is going to bitch that I gave away the story. But hey, that's cool, I've got broad shoulders and I can take the complaints. Anyway, the game starts with Derek just fresh out of his internship, and needing to immediately operate on a victim of an accident. He does so and then progresses through a few small operations, in which you slowly learn the controls and tools of the game. In fact, the first chapter of the game is essentially one large how-to guide. Derek gets reamed out several times due to his attitude, so after a pretty urgent operation, he turns himself around and starts taking things seriously. Of course, this doesn't come to a head until he learns he has a supernatural power called the Healing Touch. This ability is given to Derek relatively early in the game, and there's a stage devoted entirely to teaching you how it works. Basically, on the Wiimote and Nunchuck, you hold down the B and Z buttons, which changes the cursor to a star. You then make a motion on the screen of the said star. It doesn't have to be perfect, but practice may be necessary to get down the pattern of how the game wants it. Once you do this, the screen will gain a blue tint and time slows down to a crawl, allowing you to make life or death choices quickly without worrying about harming the patient too much. Of course, this isn't necessary in every operation, although it may help. This Healing Touch also doesn't last infinitely, so you can't just goof off while it's active. Finally, you're limited to one of these per operation, so when choosing to perform the Healing Touch, you want to make sure that it's critical to do so just in case you may need it later. So let's move on to the operations, which just so happens to be the meat of the game. Yeah, I know. Go figure. The operations are very simple to learn because the controls are easy to use. At the beginning of the operation, a character, usually Angie, will brief you and give you your objectives. Afterwards, you'll have to cut open the patient and the operation will start proper. You have to cut open every patient to begin the operation, and before that, you'll need to apply the antibiotic gel. This stuff is like a quick fix. I'll discuss all the surgical instruments shortly. So you perform the operation, with Angie directing you on what to do, and once the objectives are complete, the game will zoom back out to the outside body of the patient, and you'll just have to stitch them back up and bandage them. Every operation starts with cutting them open and ends with you closing up the wound you created. It's all the stuff in the middle that changes for each level. So while you're messing around inside the body cavity, you'll have two different things working against you. One is the time limit, which is typically either 5 or 10 minutes. Secondly, it's the vitals. This is essentially your patient's life meter. If it drops to 0, Derek is pushed away and another surgeon takes over the operation. You're then given a dramatic message saying that Derek never operated again, and you'll get the option to restart the procedure. I guess I should talk about the tools you use. First off is the antibiotic gel, which is needed to be used before you make an incision due to it disinfecting the area. The gel closes up very minor cuts as well. Lastly, you can use it to improve the patient's vitals slowly. Next is the syringe. You'll always have the option to inject a green liquid into your patient's body. This liquid will revitalize your patient, increasing their life meter. If you have downtime or really need to heal the patient before the vital meter drains, inject the green stuff into the skin. At times you may have other colored liquid that you'll need to use, but it depends on operation. Next up is the suturing tools, which are invaluable throughout the entire game. You have to constantly use it to mend any sort of lacerations that may appear. Next is a drain, which is simply used to empty pools of blood. There's a few other times where you'll need it, but it's not one of the more frequently used objects. Next is a laser, which gains more use later on in the game. You'll be using it to remove smaller tumors and also attack something called Guilt, which I'll get to soon. Ultrasound is next, and this doubles as a magnification on a few rare occasions. The ultrasound is also used primarily to take out larger tumors and also attack Guilt. Again, I'll get to Guilt soon. The scalpel is to the far left on the surgical tray, and it's used in every mission, if even just to make incisions. Finally, you have forceps, which can be tricky to use. You have to remember to pull out objects in the exact direction, because it's almost like the board game Operation. If you touch the hypothetical walls of the patient, the object you're trying to extract will fall back into place and you'll be penalized. So naturally, each of these tools have their uses, but what kind of operations will you be practicing in? Well, to start, you'll have the basic stuff, like removing glass from the inside of a body to removing tumors. But soon you'll encounter an extremely strange object in a patient, one that is moving around under the skin and causing massive wounds inside the body. You'll soon find out that this creature is called a Kyriaki, which was found to essentially turn the body against itself. You'll eventually find out how to destroy it, and then some character will talk about something called Guilt. This Guilt is considered bioterrorism, as it's a man-made disease. Throughout playing the game, you'll find out that there's 7 versions of Guilt. The Kyriaki is one of the more common ones, and in one level you'll have to operate on 5 patients, each with Kyriaki. In your first battle with one, you'll first encounter the Healing Touch. Each Guilt device has its own methods to be destroyed. Kyriaki requires you to use ultrasound to find it, use a scalpel to pop it into plain view, and then use a laser to fry it. Of course, you'll want to suture any lacerations that may pop their head. The second Guilt is Dephthera, which is destroyed simply by waiting for them to encounter the other color and then using the drain to suck up the protoplasm. And then you just quickly extract the dried up disease. If you're not quick enough, the Dephthera will constantly be spitting out small tumors, and if left alone, they'll quickly drain your patient's vitals. Third up is Treaty, which I would consider to be the most annoying of the bunch. It's essentially a large puzzle, in which you'll have to extract the spikes and then pick up the triangular pieces. If you pick up a triangular piece and there's 2 spikes next to each other anywhere, more triangles will appear. These were some of the few times I absolutely needed Healing Touch, just to take care of as much as possible before the disease spread out of control. Fourth is the Tetardi, which I found to be relatively simple. They'll cause small tumors, much like the Dephthera, and will also release toxic gases. The way to defeat them is to simply inject the same colored liquid into the colored creatures. If you inject the wrong medicine, tumors will appear. Next up is the Pempti, which is almost like a boss Guilt. I'm not going to explain this one much since it's got a huge part of the story and almost a full chapter involved with it. The 6th Guilt you encounter is called Paraskevi. It's almost like a centipede that is trying to burrow into the patient's organs. If you let them go, they'll just keep moving up towards the patient's heart, and if one of them burrows into it, the operation's over. The final Guilt is called Savato, and I won't tell you much about it other than you'll need to keep your wits about you, and don't use the Healing Touch until absolutely necessary. Now, once you defeat a Guilt, that's not the end of it. Throughout the game, you'll have to constantly be fixing up patients that were infected with the Guilt. For the majority of them, you'll encounter them at least 2 or 3 times each. Kyriaki is encountered probably close to a dozen times though. This large encounter rate doesn't mean that this is all you'll be operating on. To elaborate, one mission has you operating on a patient while fighting turbulence on an airplane. Another has you performing research tests in which you can't really fail. Possibly the most out of the norm operation is the bomb defusal mission. This one can be maddening, but as long as you take your time and listen to your assistant, you'll get out of it alive. So I mentioned the controls, but how exactly do you perform these operations? Well, it's stupidly simple. You use the nunchuck's joystick to select what tool you'd like to use. For example, you press up to select the gel, down to use the laser, and left for the scalpel. Once you select the tool you want to use, you just use the Wiimote to move your cursor on the screen and hold A to use the tool. Simple. With the forceps, you also need to use the Z button in addition to A. It makes sense. Every once in a while, you'll get a special item that you'll need to use, like bandages. To use those, you just select it by moving the cursor to it and pressing A. Again, it's all simple. So now let's touch on the other part of the game, the storyline. Again, I won't spoil it for you since it plays such a heavy part of the game, but I'll explain how it's given to you. Before every operation, and oftentimes in standalone stages, you'll sit through a ton of storyline. They're presented to you in a still-shot anime style. There are very few voiceovers, and most of them are present during the operations themselves. If you don't feel like reading the dialogue, or have already checked it out and needed to replay an operation or story segment, you can press the minus key to rapidly scroll through it all. It's actually a toggle switch, so if you use it during an operation, you can toggle it back off once you get to a part that you want to read. Now there are a few minor things that bug me about the game. For one, sometimes a Healing Touch can be difficult to activate. Maybe I'm just panicking though and not drawing it properly. In fact, now that I think of it, that's probably the case. But in seriousness, the only main complaint I have is that sometimes wounds can be difficult to see. This is more noticeable in the guild battles, especially when they cause small cuts that can only require the gel. Sometimes these cuts can be obscured by a character, the HUD, or the speech at the bottom of the screen. There were a few times where I was technically done, but because I didn't fix up the remaining problems, the game didn't proceed, so I had to guess on where the wound was. It doesn't happen a lot, but it can occur to cause some bit of confusion. So after you finish the 40 or so operations, what's next? Well, you can try to redo operations to get a better score, although there's nothing really to be unlocked. It's more just bragging rights. Then you can try on a harder difficulty. Or you can go through the special extremely hard missions. Basically, you have 7 extremely frustrating operations that have 1 guilt disease in each. You have to be an expert at this because I struggled at the Kiryaki. My patient died within seconds. Ouch. Trauma Center Second Opinion is an extremely fun game, and for a Wii game has a surprisingly mature subject matter. The only thing missing is a medical dictionary because there are plenty of medical terms thrown throughout the game. But this is definitely fun. It's fairly lengthy, the characters all have great profiles, and there's just enough oddities to prevent things from getting old. Overall, this is a very solid game, and if you own a Wii, this is the perfect game to own as it makes great use of the peripherals. Final score? 9 out of 10. This is Reaper, facebook.com/ReapersReviews. Happy fragging.